Right now, at this exact moment, in July 2026, the United States government is spending $1.22 trillion a year just to pay the interest on its national debt.
Yeah. Just the interest.
Right, just the interest. And I really want you to let that number sink in for a second because
Yeah.
that specific interest payment is now, mathematically speaking, larger than the entire U.S. national defense budget.
Which is what? Sitting at about $892 billion?
Exactly, $892 billion. And, if you look back at history, in 1918, the British Empire crossed that exact same threshold.
Right.
Before them, it was pre-revolutionary France. Habsburg Spain crossed it too. And historically speaking, and this is the crazy part, crossing that specific mathematical line is basically universally fatal for a great power.
That's the point of no return.
Yeah. So today we're doing a deep dive into this massive, just heavily researched macro-historical document that basically takes that exact premise and runs with it.
It's a fascinating read.
It really is. It's titled Roman Analogy for U.S. And the thesis here is just completely jarring. It basically argues that if you want to understand, the supply chain shortages, the rampant inflation, the massive strikes, and just the general gridlock happening outside your window right now, looking at the 1970s is totally useless.
Right. Or the Cold War. The models just don't fit.
Exactly. The author claims the only accurate predictive parallel for the physiological breakdown of the U.S. right now is actually the crisis of the 3rd century of the Roman Empire, which stretched from roughly 235 to 284 CE.
It is an incredibly sobering premise. But what really makes this document so compelling is that it doesn't just rely on, historical poetry or loose comparisons.
Yeah, it brings receipts.
It really does. It backs up this thesis with this remarkably dense layer of modern telemetry. It takes 3rd century Rome's structural insolvency, its hyperinflation, and this desperate executive overreach, and maps those exact mechanisms directly onto the physical and economic conditions the U.S. is facing right this minute.
Now, before we actually get into the mechanisms of how an empire actually fractures, we need to set a hard rule for this deep dive.
Yes, very important.
Because this source text covers highly charged, ongoing political and social events from this current year. We're going to be dissecting specific actions taken by the current presidential administration, aggressive maneuvers by federal agencies, controversial military operations, domestic protests, all of it.
Right.
So we need to explicitly state, we are strictly here to explore the document's theoretical framework. We are not taking political sides, and we are certainly not endorsing the views, the politics, or the specific judgments contained within the text.
Yeah, that is a crucial distinction. Our mission today is entirely analytical. We're just taking the factual claims and the behavioral models the author provides and using them as a lens.
Just testing the math, basically.
Exactly. We want to see if this specific Roman historical framework actually does the math and helps explain the absolute chaos of 2026. We're simply the messengers reporting on how the source material connects these dots.
Perfect. So, with that baseline established, we need to correct a major historical misconception right out of the gate.
Oh, the fall of Rome thing.
Yeah, because when the document refers to the crisis of the 3rd century, it explicitly notes that we are not talking about the famous fall of Rome in 476 CE.
Right.
Like, if you are picturing barbarians actively burning down the Colosseum, you are in the wrong century entirely. So what exactly is the specific crisis?
Right. You really have to erase that image of the ruined, sacked city. The 3rd century crisis is this much earlier, highly specific phase of structural decay.
Okay.
You have to understand that prior to this period, Rome wasn't just, a big army. It was a hyper-complex, incredibly globalized republic.
Like a modern superpower.
Exactly. It had secure, sprawling borders, a highly stable administrative state, and this massive interconnected economy that moved goods from Britain all the way to India. But during the 3rd century, that complexity just hit a wall.
The math stopped working.
Yeah. The empire rapidly transitioned into a state of severe structural bankruptcy. They faced massively overextended military commitments on multiple borders simultaneously. And because the central state could no longer afford to provide basic economic stability or even physical security, it tried to mandate that stability through increasingly desperate, flailing executive tyranny.
And when you try to force stability onto a broken system through sheer coercion, it just shatters, right?
Completely.
The citizens realize the central government is completely hollowed out, and the empire begins fracturing into what the document calls localized survival nodes.
Exactly. When the center can no longer hold, the populace just stops complying. They retreat into local self-sufficient enclaves just to survive the economic fallout.
Which brings us to the fundamental premise of this entire breakdown. Long before an empire's physical borders collapse under invasion, its checkbook completely implodes.
It always starts with the money.
Right.
The foundation of this crisis is the unforgiving mathematics of debt. So let's look at the velocity of debasement. How did a hyper-complex economic superpower like Rome actually go broke?
Well, it always starts slowly. Right. Usually disguised as a temporary emergency measure. To understand the Roman collapse, you have to look at the primary currency of the realm, which was the denarius.
The silver coin.
Right, a silver coin. Under Emperor Nero, the first major debasement was actually relatively slight. He needed to fund the massive rebuilding of Rome after the Great Fire, so he quietly dropped the silver content of the coin from 3.9 grams to 3.4 grams.
That's sneaky.
Yeah, he introduced a little bit of baser metals, like copper, into the alloy. It was a way to quietly expand the money supply and pay the bills without causing an immediate panic in the markets.
It's essentially the Roman equivalent of quantitative easing, isn't it? You print a little extra money, dilute the value slightly, and just hope the economic growth outpaces the inflation.
Precisely. And for a while, subsequent emperors managed to scrape by using their own creative revenue streams.
Like what? Well, Emperor Vespasian famously instituted a tax on public latrines, which is actually where we get his famous quote, "Money does not stink."
Oh, wow. I didn't know that.
Yeah. And then Emperor Trajan managed to conquer Dacia and injected massive amounts of looted gold and silver directly into the treasury, which masked the underlying structural deficits for a bit. But the structural integrity of the entire Roman economy truly began to fracture after the Antonine Plague swept through the empire around 165 CE.
Right. The source mentions that the plague absolutely decimated the population across all classes. And when you lose a massive chunk of your population, you aren't just losing citizens, you are permanently deleting your tax base.
You lose your tax base, you lose your agricultural labor force, and crucially, the plague brought the empire's silver mining operations to an absolute halt.
Oh, geez.
Yeah. So you have plunging tax revenues intersecting with escalating military costs because the Germanic tribes and Persian empires are constantly testing the borders.
The worst possible timing.
Exactly. Enter Emperor Septimius Severus. Knowing the state was broke, but terrified of losing power, he drastically increased the salaries of his legionaries to an unprecedented 450 denarii a year.
Just to keep them loyal.
Right. His explicit dying instruction to his sons was phenomenal in its sheer arrogance. He told them, "Be harmonious, pay the soldiers well, and to Hades with everyone else."
That is just naked fiscal dominance of the military over the survival of the state.
Total dominance.
You are abandoning the public good entirely just to maintain the monopoly on violence? But wait, if the silver mines are closed and the tax base is dead, how does his son actually pay those soldiers?
He resorts to a mathematical lie. His son, Emperor Caracalla, introduced a brand new coin called the antinomianus. It was officially billed to the public as a double denarius, supposedly worth 2 of the old coins.
Okay.
The problem was it only contained about 80% of the silver of 2 old coins. The state was legally mandating that a coin was worth more than the physical reality of the metal inside it. And once that seal was broken, the debasement hit terminal velocity. By the time you reach Emperor Gallienus in the 260s CE, the silver content of that coin had plummeted from an already low 36% down to a microscopic 2.4% to 5%.
The source actually includes this incredibly visceral, almost grotesque mechanical detail about how the Roman mentors achieved that deception at the end.
The acid washing.
Yes, they weren't just mixing metals anymore. They would take these highly debased, almost entirely copper coins and literally wash them in a bath of weak acid.
Right.
The acid would corrode the copper on the very surface of the coin, leaving behind this incredibly thin, deceptive, microscopic layer of silver on the outside.
It was quite literally a physical facade of wealth. It looked shiny and silver when it came out of the mint, but the moment it started circulating, that microscopic layer wore off and the dull copper just shone through.
And you can't trick a market forever.
No, you can't. The Roman merchants and citizens figured it out almost immediately. They started refusing the coins, or they demanded exponentially more of them for basic goods.
Which means inflation.
Catastrophic hyperinflation. The price of wheat and basic staples multiplied by factors of 1,000 or more in a matter of years. Eventually, the Roman populace abandoned the state currency entirely, retreating into localized barter systems and subsistence economies just to feed themselves.
Which brings us directly to the modern parallel. The document argues that the United States in 2026 is on the exact same terminal fiscal trajectory, operating under the exact same delusions.
Yep.
And it frames this modern crisis around that macroeconomic principle I mentioned at the very beginning of the deep dive, Ferguson's law.
Ferguson's law is brilliant because it acts as an absolute objective tripwire for geopolitical decline. It states that any great power that spends more of its capital simply servicing the interest on its accumulated public debt than it allocates to its own national defense is officially on the precipice of systemic collapse.
The document refers to it as an inescapable centripetal force. It creates this vortex that violently draws resources away from innovation, away from infrastructure, and away from national security, just to feed the ghost of past spending. And as the source notes, the United States didn't just cross this line in 2026, we shattered it.
Dude.
The fiscal year 2025 deficit alone was an astounding $1.8 trillion. But the truly fatal metric is that $1.22 trillion in annualized debt servicing we talked about.
To contextualize how catastrophic that is, the global hegemon, the entity responsible for securing global sea lanes and maintaining the reserve currency, has entirely consumed its discretionary fiscal capacity, just paying the penalty on its own past behavior.
I think the best way to understand this is to look at a typical household. It is exactly like a family that has maxed out every line of credit they have.
That's a great analogy.
Right. They are taking out cash advances on a credit card with a 24% interest rate, not to buy a new car or fix a leaking roof, but solely to make the absolute minimum payment on their mortgage so the bank doesn't foreclose. There is literally zero capital left for groceries, for emergencies, or for the future. You are just mathematically waiting for the system to snap.
That is exactly the dynamic. But on a sovereign level, it's vastly more dangerous.
All right.
Because the government is actively cannibalizing the economic output of its own citizens to sustain the illusion of solvency.
Hold on, though. Whenever you bring up the national debt, the immediate counterargument is always, this is the United States. We control our own fiat currency.
Right, the magic money tree.
Yeah, exactly. We aren't Rome relying on physical silver mines. Why can't the Federal Reserve just step in and fix this? Can't they just adjust interest rates to manage the inflation?
And this is where the source explicitly outlines the inescapable mathematical trap that the Federal Reserve is currently caught in. We are experiencing massive supply-driven energy inflation right now.
Okay.
Historically, the standard central bank playbook for fighting any kind of runaway inflation is to aggressively raise interest rates. You make borrowing incredibly expensive, which cools down corporate expansion, reduces consumer spending, and forcefully slows down the velocity of money.
You essentially induce a controlled recession to kill the inflation.
Exactly. But if the Fed aggressively raises rates right now to fight that energy inflation, what happens to that $1.22 trillion in debt servicing?
Oh, it goes up.
Right. The interest on the national debt operates on a floating refinancing basis.
Right.
If rates go up, the cost to service that debt spirals instantly into hyper-exponential territory. It would trigger an immediate U.S. sovereign debt crisis.
So they literally can't.
No, they can't. The bond market would completely collapse, and the federal government would functionally default because it literally cannot afford to pay higher interest rates on a debt pile this massive.
So raising rates destroys the bond market and bankrupts the government, which means they have absolutely no choice but to keep rates artificially low.
But if they hold rates down to protect the government's balance sheet, they are fundamentally stimulating an already contracting domestic economy. They are allowing that energy inflation to run absolutely rampant through the supply chain.
It's a catch-22.
It is. And inflation, as the document keenly points out, is not a victimless phenomenon. It is a deeply regressive, invisible tax that aggressively targets the working and middle classes. It destroys their purchasing power daily.
So the central bank is totally paralyzed.
Entirely paralyzed. It is the exact dilemma of the 3rd century Roman emperors. The state can no longer finance its massive geopolitical footprint without systematically destroying the daily purchasing power of its own citizens.
It's one thing to watch your economy stutter and realize you are trapped in a fiscal nightmare, but it's an entirely different level of crisis when the state realizes it's failing and decides to just break the thermometer.
Right.
If the economic reality is genuinely this grim, if we are essentially acid washing our own digital currency, how on earth does a modern government keep the public, and more importantly, the international bond markets, from just completely panicking?
You generate an illusion of health. You manipulate the telemetry. The document explicitly calls this phase the Potemkin ledger.
Right, named after the fake, picturesque villages Grigory Potemkin supposedly built to hide the poverty of Russia from Empress Catherine the Great.
Exactly.
So, how is the U.S. building a Potemkin ledger in 2026? The source points directly to a massive, glaring divergence between what the government statistical agencies are reporting and what the underlying math proves is actually happening.
The GDP numbers.
Right. It specifically brings up the Bureau of Economic Analysis, the BEA. They released their Q1 2026 gross domestic product report, and it showed a solid 2.1% growth rate. Simultaneously, S&P Global projected unemployment staying incredibly steady at 4.3%. On paper, that sounds like a perfectly normal, resilient, healthy economy.
It does, until you peel back the headline and look at the underlying gross domestic income, or GDI. The document highlights a massive structural divergence between these two metrics that exposes what it terms a cloaked recession.
We really need to explain the mechanics of how GDP and GDI are supposed to interact because this discrepancy is terrifying once you actually understand it.
In standard macroeconomic accounting, GDP measures aggregate expenditures. It calculates everything we are spending as a nation. GDI, on the other hand, measures aggregate income. It calculates everything we are actually earning.
Okay.
Theoretically, these are just two sides of the exact same coin. Every single dollar you spend at a store is a dollar earned by the business owner. Therefore, these two numbers, GDP and GDI, must align almost perfectly over time.
But they are aligning.
No, they aren't. The document traces a profound disconnect that began manifesting in late 2025. In the third quarter of 2025, GDP was reported at a highly robust 4.3%. But GDI was incredibly sluggish, limping along at only 2.4%.
The source labels that massive 1.9% divergence the truth teller gap. If expenditures are skyrocketing but actual income is stagnant, where's that spending coming from?
That is the core of the illusion. It indicates that the headline economic growth the government is touting is a complete statistical mirage. Consumers aren't spending money because they are earning more wealth or getting productive raises.
They're going into debt.
Exactly. They are spending based on desperate short-term debt financing. They are maxing out credit cards just to afford the inflated cost of groceries.
Jeez.
Simultaneously, corporations are artificially boosting the GDP by aggressively hoarding physical inventory ahead of anticipated geopolitical tariffs. It is panic buying masquerading as economic health. It is not organic domestic wealth creation.
The physical reality of the working class is totally disconnected from the headline data, and the text proves this by contrasting the official government narrative with the internal modeling done by the New York Federal Reserve.
The DSGE model.
Yeah, the New York Fed uses this highly complex framework called the DSGE model, the Dynamic Stochastic General Equilibrium Model, and their internal numbers tell a wildly different story.
What do they find?
They had to officially revise their 2026 core inflation forecasts drastically upward, jumping from 2.4% to a staggering 3.1%, explicitly citing massive, completely underestimated shocks from energy prices and tariff markups. When you factor in that real inflation rate, real aggregate income for the American citizen is deeply negative. But the executive branch is still publishing these pristine, positive economic metrics.
The author uses a fantastic medical analogy here. They describe the administrative state as operating under total systemic anosognosia.
Anosognosia.
Yeah, it's a neurological condition where a patient is cognitively blind to their own disease. If they're paralyzed on their left side, their brain actively fabricates a reality where they believe they are perfectly healthy. The state literally cannot perceive its own economic failure.
But how does a modern superpower lose the ability to see its own data? I mean, these federal statistical agencies, the BLS, the BA, they're historically incredibly rigorous, nonpartisan institutions. How does the state voluntarily blind itself?
The document points to a massive, deliberate purge of the administrative state. It draws a direct parallel to the Roman emperors who systematically purged the Senate.
Right.
When an emperor wanted to consolidate absolute power and remove any dissenting reality, they simply removed the senators who dared to point out the empire's flaws. In the modern U.S. context, this administrative purge was achieved through a legal mechanism known as the Schedule F employment reclassification.
I want to walk through the timeline the source provides because it shows how methodical this was. Schedule F was originally conceived via Executive Order 13957 way back in late 2020.
Right.
It was then aggressively reinstated and expanded in January 2025 through EO 14171 and finally codified and strictly enforced on June 3, 2026 with EO 13410.
And under the political banner of, increasing accountability and removing bureaucratic bloat, this sweeping application of Schedule F stripped fundamental civil service protections from approximately 162,000 career federal employees across the entire government.
162,000 people.
Yes. It engineered an immediate, catastrophic hollowing out of the state's institutional memory and its rigorous regulatory capacity.
Let's connect the dots here, though. If you fire a mid-level manager at the Department of Energy or a civil service director in Washington, how does that directly result in the government hallucinating fake GDP and inflation numbers?
Because the purge directly crippled the specific operational capacity of the statistical agencies tasked with measuring the physical economy.
Yeah.
You aren't just firing managers, you are firing the field researchers, the statisticians, and the data analysts at the Bureau of Labor Statistics.
The people actually collecting the numbers.
Exactly. And the document notes that compounding the personnel purge, there was a devastating 43-day federal government shutdown in late 2025.
Oh, I remember that.
During that prolonged shutdown, actual field data collection completely collapsed. The response rates for crucial household economic surveys plummeted to a historic low of 64%.
When you think about it, if the government is threatening mass deportations, or people are enraged about inflation, or federal offices are just closed, citizens are going to stop opening the door or answering the phone for federal surveyors.
All right, they just opt out.
They literally aren't getting physical data from the real world anymore.
Exactly. The human telemetry is gone. And bereft of actual on-the-ground personnel and valid survey responses, the government is increasingly relying on backward-looking, automated algorithms to fill in the massive blank spots. The document specifically calls out the birth-death model.
Let's explain what that algorithm actually does, because it sounds incredibly morbid.
In economic terms, the birth-death model is a statistical algorithm used by the BLS to estimate how many new unrecorded businesses were created births and how many quietly closed deaths in a given month.
Okay, that makes sense.
It is designed to capture the margins of the economy that surveys miss. But the fundamental flaw is that the algorithm relies on historical smoothing. It is designed for stable, linear economic times.
Which we are not in.
Not at all. When the economy is experiencing extreme, volatile contraction, when restaurants and contractors are quietly shuttering in droves due to inflation, the algorithm doesn't know that. It simply looks at past data and aggressively hallucinates massive job growth and pristine economic health based on broken, incomplete data feeds.
Wow.
The executive branch deliberately destroyed its own statistical telemetry to consolidate political power, which guaranteed it would be mathematically blind to the impending collapse.
That is just deeply structurally terrifying. You have a pilot flying a jumbo jet in a hurricane, but he smashed all the instruments on the dashboard because he didn't like that they were flashing red, and now he's just guessing his altitude based on how he feels.
That's a perfect way to describe it.
Which leads perfectly into the next inevitable phase of the crisis. When a leader is operating completely blind to their own failure and the physical math of the empire is breaking down, history shows they never just step back and admit defeat.
No, they double down.
They resort to blunt force coercion. They try to literally mandate that reality conforms to their will.
It is the ultimate coercion feedback loop. And to understand how this always plays out, the document points back to the Roman precedent. Emperor Diocletian's infamous edict on maximum prices, issued in 301 CE.
Right.
Diocletian was facing rampant hyperinflation, largely caused by those decades of currency debasement and acid washing we just discussed. The military was threatening mutiny because their pay was worthless. So instead of fixing the currency, Diocletian attempted to suspend the immutable laws of supply and demand through sheer imperial edict.
He essentially declared by fiat that inflation was now illegal.
That is exactly what he did. He issued a massive, exhaustive edict, fixing hard price ceilings on over 900 specific commodities, everything from grain and wine to shoes, and 130 different grades of labor.
And if you broke the rule?
To ensure compliance, the penalty for profiteering, hoarding, or speculating was death.
You could literally be executed by the state for charging a few extra copper coins for a bushel of wheat.
Yes.
What actually happens when a government tries to force a command economy at the point of a sword like that?
It results in an immediate, spectacular, and catastrophic failure. Goods instantly vanished from legitimate, visible markets.
Because nobody wants to sell at a loss.
Exactly. Think about it mechanically. Why would a Roman merchant sell his grain in the public square at a state-mandated loss when he could quietly sell it in the underground barter economy for a massive profit? The physical reality of severe resource scarcity easily overwhelmed the emperor's administrative fiat.
You can't legislate reality.
You cannot legislate abundance. You cannot threaten a farm into producing more wheat when the soil is depleted.
So how does Diocletian's ghost manifest in the U.S. in 2026? The document introduces a highly specific behavioral model it calls the dominance execution loop. It argues that we shouldn't view the government's current behavior through the lens of traditional political negotiation.
Right.
Instead, it treats the administration's actions as a systemic, algorithmic political bankruptcy playbook.
The author describes this algorithm as incredibly predictive. They claim it scores a 9.5 out of 10 for strategic retrodiction, meaning if you apply this model to past events, it perfectly predicts how the executive branch reacted.
Interesting.
It posits that the executive branch operates strictly on a dominance equals success model. It is an unbounded, uncompromising pursuit of unilateral power. And the methodology driving this is described as the Trump Chapter 11 thesis, which is fundamentally designed to systematically dismantle institutional checks and balances through legal exhaustion.
The mechanics of this playbook rely on something the author calls sequential neutralization. If you view the U.S. government like a massive corporation going through a hostile bankruptcy, the executive targets the unsecured creditors first.
The low-hanging fruit.
Exactly. In this analogy, the unsecured creditors are public opinion, legacy media, and political norms. You neutralize them through sheer volume of controversy. Once they're exhausted, you move to aggressively liquidate the secured creditors, which are the hard institutional guardrails.
Right. The judiciary, the federal watchdogs, the inspectors general, and that massive civil service block we discussed during the Schedule F purge.
But the most vital, dangerous element of the dominance execution loop is how it algorithms the executive's response to pushback.
This is key.
If a normal administration faces a severe court loss, a congressional subpoena, or a physical breakdown in the supply chain, they usually retreat, reassess, and compromise. This algorithm predicts the exact opposite. Pushback is never viewed as a signal to compromise. It is always perceived as a threat to dominance.
Always. The program's response is to immediately fabricate a broader, encompassing crisis, assert plenary emergency authority, and attempt a forceful end run around whatever institution or physical reality is trying to constrain them.
So they just escalate.
So when the U.S. economy began violently buckling under the physical reality of domestic fuel shortages and energy inflation in 2026, the executive relied entirely on this loop. They utilized the National Emergencies Act to issue sweeping, unilateral executive orders to artificially mandate economic order.
Which brings us to the most perfect modern equivalent of Diocletian's edict, the Jones Act paradox. This is a staggering example of how executive coercion completely fails when it collides with physical market physics.
We really have to lay out the legal framework first. The Jones Act, formerly known as the Merchant Marine Act of 1920, is a foundational piece of U.S. maritime law.
Okay.
It dictates that any goods shipped by water between two U.S. ports must be transported on vessels that are built, owned, and operated by United States citizens. This is highly protectionist.
Right.
In 2026, facing massive, crippling domestic fuel shortages that were intrinsically linked to an ongoing kinetic conflict with Iran, the Department of Homeland Security stepped in and granted a highly unusual, limited 60-day waiver of the Jones Act.
The official stated rationale from DHS was that they needed to ensure the immediate, unimpeded flow of energy commodities along the U.S. coastline to directly support Department of Defense military operations. On its face, it sounds like a totally logical, decisive emergency measure to protect national security.
It sounds incredibly decisive, right until you analyze the physical market reality of what actually occurred on the water. The document cites a rigorous, granular after-action analysis conducted by MARAD, the U.S. Maritime Administration.
What did they find?
That 60-day waiver ultimately facilitated 78 distinct maritime voyages. MARAD analyzed the cargo and destination of every single one of those ships and found that precisely 0 of those 78 voyages addressed any adverse effect on military operations.
Literally 0. Not a single drop of fuel helped the military.
None. The cargoes transported under the waiver were entirely commercial-grade fuels moving between private corporate refineries. They didn't even meet the stringent Department of Defense military specifications. They weren't carrying JP-5 jet fuel for aircraft carriers or F-76 naval distillate.
So it was just a handout.
It was just a massive corporate loophole. And worse, the waiver actively transferred control of American domestic commerce to foreign adversaries. Marad found that 58.5% of the vessels utilized under this supposedly patriotic waiver were actually built in South Korea, and 23.1% were built in China.
You're kidding.
No. And the holding companies operating them were heavily controlled by Chinese and Singaporean financial interests.
It is exactly like the Diocletian Edict. You pass an emergency decree that effectively says water must flow uphill, And then the executive is completely shocked when the water continues to flow downhill, following the path of least resistance directly into the pockets of foreign commercial entities.
A zag.
And the document highlights this ultimate glaring paradox that exposes the total failure of the coercion loop. During that exact same 60-day national emergency window, a window specifically justified by the desperate need to keep fuel at home for national security, the United States actually exported a staggering 731 million barrels of petroleum to foreign markets.
Because the global commodity prices for oil were massively elevated by the ongoing war in the Middle East.
Right.
U.S. refiners are not patriotic charities. They are highly rational market actors programmed to maximize corporate profitability. Given the choice between selling fuel cheaply to a domestic market or selling it at a massive premium to Europe or Asia, they chased the high global prices.
Of course they did.
They aggressively drained domestic physical inventories, dangerously thin, completely ignoring the executive's intent. Just like Diocletian executing merchants for hiding grain, the modern executive branch discovered the hard way that political decrees simply cannot override the physical incentives of global capitalism.
So we have an administration caught in this endless escalation loop domestically, trying to mandate an economy that is slipping through its fingers. But as the document so clearly points out, this kind of unilateral executive behavior never stays confined to domestic policy.
It bleeds outward.
Just as Rome fatally overextended itself trying to simultaneously fight Germanic confederations in the north and the heavily armored Sassanid Persians in the east, the U.S. executive triggered a catastrophic multi-theater kinetic crisis. This takes us to the true geopolitical tipping point of 2026.
We really need to examine exactly how the physical global supply chain was systematically broken. The true genesis of the massive structural deficits we are seeing today occurred in early 2026. Operating strictly within the uncompromising parameters of that dominance execution loop we just outlined, the president unilaterally authorized a massive, preemptive kinetic strike on Iran.
The document refers to it as Operation Epic Fury. It was authorized on February 27, 2026. And crucially, it was executed by actively circumventing any congressional debate, oversight, or formal authorization.
Which fits the loop perfectly.
Right. The execution commenced the very next day, February 28th, at 1:15 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. And the sheer physical scale of this bombardment is just difficult to comprehend. U.S. Central Command, operating in tandem with the Israeli Air Force, executed a synchronized, overwhelming bombardment that involved nearly 900 combat sorties within just the first 12 hours.
They deployed an absolutely overwhelming array of strategic military assets. They utilized B-1 and B-2 stealth bombers flying directly from the continental U.S., B-52 Stratofortresses, F-22 and F-35 stealth fighters, and massive ordnance launched from the USS Abraham Lincoln Carrier Strike Group.
It was massive.
By early April, CENTCOM officially reported striking over 13,000 distinct targets across Iran, severely degrading their integrated air defenses, and systematically destroying over 155 Iranian naval vessels.
And from a strictly tactical standpoint, the opening salvo actually achieved its primary assassination goals. The strike successfully killed Iran's supreme leader, Ali Khamenei, along with the top echelon of the IRGC Navy commanders.
Right.
But the grand strategic objective of the executive branch, which was engineering a rapid, total regime collapse and forcing Iran into submission, failed completely. The regime didn't crumble. The Iranian system simply absorbed the blow and swiftly replaced the deceased leader with his son, Mojtaba Khamenei, which guaranteed a highly motivated, protracted, and brutal conflict.
And this is precisely where the geopolitical overextension perfectly mirrors the Roman crisis. The U.S. executive branch aggressively assumed Iran would immediately capitulate under overwhelming force.
Which didn't happen.
Instead, the IRGC absorbed the kinetic strike and immediately triggered the structural strangulation of the entire global economy. Within hours of the initial strikes, the IRGC enacted an absolute, uncompromising maritime blockade of the Strait of Hormuz.
For anyone listening who might not obsessively follow global maritime shipping routes, we need to explain just how vital the Strait of Hormuz is to the basic functioning of human civilization.
Geographically, it is an unparalleled, irreplaceable bottleneck. Historically, the Strait of Hormuz processes roughly 1/5 of total global oil consumption every single day.
1/5.
Furthermore, it processes 20% to 25% of the world's liquefied natural gas, or LNG. The immediate violent closure of that strait by Iranian anti-ship missiles and naval mines trapped massive, irreplaceable volumes of energy inside the Persian Gulf.
Just locked it all in.
It resulted in an immediate net structural shortage of roughly 7.1 to 10.1 million barrels of oil per day on the global market. It completely and instantly neutralized the massive export capacities of Iraq, Kuwait, and Qatar.
But the global energy market didn't instantly collapse on day one of the blockade, right? There was a buffer.
Yes, there was a temporary safety valve,
Yeah.
and it relied entirely on Saudi Arabia. The Saudis possessed a physical bypass. They successfully diverted about 4.19 million barrels per day of their own crude production away from the Persian Gulf, pumping it through their massive overland east-west pipeline to the Red Sea port of Yanbu, where it could be safely loaded onto tankers.
Okay, so that bought some time.
It acted as a critical, stabilizing safety valve for the global economy for several months.
That is until July 20, 2026. The text details how Yemen's Houthi forces, acting in direct coordination with Iran, enacted a comprehensive, highly lethal maritime embargo against Saudi Arabia via the Red Sea and the Bab el-Mandeb Strait.
Yeah.
The Houthi general explicitly justified this escalation as an equation of an eye for an eye, actively targeting that specific Saudi pipeline bypass.
Which violently transformed a manageable single choke point crisis into a catastrophic, inescapable dual choke point blockade. With both the Persian Gulf and the Red Sea locked down by anti-ship ballistic missiles, major global shipping corporations, titans like Maersk and MSC, were forced to abandon those vital routes entirely.
They couldn't risk the ships.
No, they had to permanently reroute their massive tanker fleets all the way around the Cape of Good Hope at the treacherous southern tip of Africa.
Which physically adds roughly 11,000 nautical miles and 14 to 21 days of transit time to every single voyage. It exponentially increases fuel consumption just to move the ships, and it locks massive, compounding logistical costs into the baseline of the global economy through at least 2027.
It's a logistical nightmare.
Now, hold on. This is where I have to ask the obvious question that anyone listening is probably shouting at their device right now.
Let's hear it.
Whenever we talk about Middle East oil shortages and massive price spikes, my first thought is always the Strategic Petroleum Reserve. We literally hollowed out massive salt caverns in Texas and Louisiana in the 1970s for this exact specific nightmare scenario, to act as an impenetrable buffer against an Arab oil embargo. Didn't the administration just tap the SPR to flood the market and stabilize prices?
They absolutely did.
Yeah.
And in fact, the global market initially avoided a catastrophic $150 per barrel price spike in the spring solely because the Department of Energy aggressively activated the SPR in mid-March 2026.
Okay.
They initiated a massive, unprecedented 172 million barrel emergency commitment, extracting and selling the oil at a highly aggressive rate of roughly 1.4 million barrels per day.
But the source aggressively emphasizes that the SPR is inherently physically finite. It is not a magical infinite well. And by July 2026, the document states the U.S. hit buffer exhaustion.
Let's look at the brutal mathematics provided in the text. The absolute maximum physical capacity of the SPR is roughly 714 million barrels. However, before Operation Epic Fury even launched in February 2026, the inventory had already been drawn down to about 415 million barrels due to previous political maneuvers.
So it's already low.
By the time we reached July, following that massive emergency release, the reserve was drained down to roughly 325.7 million barrels. That is the lowest volumetric level the United States has seen since 1983.
And what's truly alarming is how close that is to the absolute bottom. The document notes that the EPCA statutory security floor is 252 million barrels.
Right.
If you drain the oil below that level, you risk causing permanent structural and geological damage to the salt domes themselves, which could collapse the entire reserve infrastructure. We are literally physically scraping the bottom of the geological barrel.
And here is the truly devastating mechanism that most people completely overlook, which the source defines as the refining paradox.
The refining paradox, what is that?
Even if we had oil in the SPR, it wouldn't solve the immediate crisis. The massive U.S. Gulf Coast refinery complexes are primarily engineered at a molecular level to crack and process heavy sour crude imported specifically from the Middle East and Venezuela.
Oh.
They are chemically not optimized for the light, sweet crude that is abundant in both the SPR and domestic shale production. So even with the SPR flowing at maximum capacity, the sudden, violent loss of compatible Middle Eastern feedstock forced U.S. refiners into a desperate scramble to reconfigure their entire operations,
Resulting in massive inefficiencies that caused domestic retail diesel fuel to spike to a devastating $5.37 per gallon. And that specific diesel spike triggers something the text ominously calls agricultural contagion.
This is where we see how deeply, terrifyingly interconnected modern civilization truly is. But modern agriculture is completely biologically reliant on synthetic nitrogen fertilizers, which require massive amounts of natural gas to produce. The Persian Gulf doesn't just export oil. It historically accounts for 30% to 35% of all global seaborne urea exports and 45% to 50% of the world's traded sulfur. The dual blockade trapped those critical agricultural resources right alongside the oil.
The cascading result was U.S. agricultural fertilizer inputs violently spiking by 28% almost overnight. The document provides this absolutely terrifying metric. The fertilizer to corn affordability ratio completely crashed.
It's grim.
To put that in human terms, American farmers now have to expend up to 221 bushels of their harvested corn just to purchase a single ton of urea fertilizer for the next planting season. That mathematical reality guarantees widespread crop yield destruction and massive, severe food inflation heading into 2027. You can't just mandate that food be cheaper when the chemical inputs to grow it are trapped in a war zone. Okay, so let's summarize the board state. We have rampant hyperinflation, an exhausted emergency oil reserve, agricultural contagion, and a violent dual choke point blockade in the Middle East. If the U.S. military is still the most powerful kinetic force on the planet, why can't we just surge our industrial base, build more ships, build more smart weapons, and physically force the straits open? We are the arsenal of democracy, right?
We were. But the document explains exactly why we can't just build our way out of this. It's because of a second, totally silent blockade occurring simultaneously in Asia.
Okay.
And this brings us to the concept of strategic asphyxiation. The U.S. cannot simply build more high-tech weapons because China has engineered a brilliant, highly sophisticated supply chain embargo on the exact microscopic materials required to build them.
We are talking about the rare earth element, or REE, blockade. The source points specifically to China's MOFCOM announcement number 46, which was issued way back in December 2024. The document describes this policy not as a blunt embargo, but as a regime of strategic strangulation, explicitly designed to surgically degrade the operational readiness of the U.S. military-industrial complex over time.
It is a masterclass in asymmetrical warfare. It's a highly targeted, bifurcated regime. China deliberately allowed a tenuous, slow flow of these critical materials to continue for commercial entities like smartphone manufacturers or electric vehicle companies so they wouldn't trigger a total global economic meltdown.
Keep the regular economy humming.
Exactly. But they established a hard, uncompromising, absolute prohibition on exports to any entity tied to U.S. military end users. And the U.S. defense apparatus is profoundly existentially vulnerable across three critical material pillars.
We really need to dive into the physics and chemistry of these three pillars because it reveals just how fragile our military dominance actually is. Pillar 1 is a metalloid called antimony. The document calls it the Achilles heel of munitions.
The vulnerability here is staggering. The United States has not domestically mined antimony in any commercially viable quantity since 2001. We rely almost entirely on Chinese processing.
Why does that matter so much?
Because antimony sulfide is a completely non-substitutable chemical compound required for munitions primers. It's the literal chemical spark that ignites the propellant in everything from a 5.56 rifle round to a massive 155mm artillery shell. Without it, your guns simply click.
Wow.
Furthermore, a compound called indium antimonide is absolutely essential for manufacturing the highly sensitive midways infrared focal plane arrays used in Javelin anti-tank missile seekers. Without it, your smart weapons go completely blind and your artillery won't fire. By January 2026, the text notes that defense contractor stockpiles of this material were dangerously critically low.
Then you have Pillar 2, which involves heavy rare earth, specifically elements called dysprosium and terbium.
This vulnerability comes down to the unforgiving physics of coercivity, which is essentially a magnet's thermal stability. The U.S. military relies heavily on neodymium iron boron permanent magnets. They are the most powerful magnets on Earth.
What's that?
But they have a fatal flaw. They rapidly lose their magnetic properties and demagnetize at high temperatures. Dysprosium and terbium must be baked into the alloy to maintain that magnetic stability when the operating environment exceeds 80 degrees Celsius.
Like in a jet engine.
Exactly. These specific heat-resistant magnets are absolutely critical for the actuators in F-35 jet engines and the guidance fins on Tomahawk missiles. China currently controls roughly 99% of the entire global processing capacity for these specific heavy elements, and there are currently no viable physical substitutes.
And finally, Pillar 3, gallium and germanium. The document refers to these as the military's electronic eyes.
Gallium nitride is the foundational semiconductor material that forms the backbone of active electronically scanned array, or AES, radars. These are the advanced radars used in Patriot missile defense systems and stealth fighters to track multiple targets simultaneously.
Right.
Germanium is entirely indispensable for manufacturing thermal imaging lenses for night vision and highly efficient solar cells for military satellites.
Okay, so the Chinese government officially cuts off direct sales to U.S. defense primes like Lockheed Martin and Raytheon. But we live in a globalized economy. Couldn't Lockheed just set up a shell company or buy the necessary components from a friendly supplier in Europe or Japan or South Korea?
That is exactly where the legal trap snaps shut. The document meticulously explains the impending expiration of temporary diplomatic waivers in November 2026, which activates something called the 0.1% de minimis rule.
This is essentially a legal pathogen. It operates exactly like a virus infecting a supply chain.
It's a perfect analogy. Under this incredibly aggressive rule, any foreign-produced magnet manufactured anywhere in the entire world legally requires a Chinese export license if even 0.1% of its value stems from Chinese origin trace elements.
Wow. So they're legally extending their domestic jurisdiction over the entire interconnected global supply chain. If a friendly European company manufactures a magnet and tries to sell it to Lockheed Martin, and that magnet has even a microscopic drop of Chinese dysprosium baked into it, the European company gets sanctioned and cut off from the Chinese market if they make the sale.
Exactly. It forces global allies to choose between supplying the U.S. military or maintaining access to the indispensable Chinese materials they need for their own commercial survival.
And they'll choose their own survival.
Right. And because U.S. prime contractors were officially placed on China's unreliable entity list, their global subsidiaries are legally blockaded. The physical material dependencies required to wage modern war are staggering.
The numbers in the text are wild.
The text notes that a single F-35 Lightning II fighter jet requires exactly 417 kilograms of rare earth materials per airframe. A single Virginia-class nuclear submarine requires an astounding 4,173 kilograms. When the supply chain is legally infected by that 0.1% rule, you simply cannot build these machines.
But we've been hearing for years about reshoring. Politicians constantly talk about bringing manufacturing back to the U.S., opening new domestic mines, securing the supply chain. The text even mentions the One Big Beautiful Bill Act of 2025 and the aggressive use of the Defense Production Act. Are those not working?
The political intention and the funding are certainly there, but the physical execution faces a temporal phenomenon known as the Valley of Death.
The Valley of Death.
Yeah. Building a mine and a processing facility is not like building a software app. It takes years of heavy engineering. Domestic champions like MP Materials operate the Mountain Pass mine in California, which is a massive step forward. But their heavy rare earth separation lines and the critical downstream metallurgical facilities required for actually manufacturing the finished magnets won't reach full operational capacity until at least 2028.
But the crisis is now.
Exactly. The kinetic crisis is happening right now in 2026. The U.S. military is caught in a 2-year vulnerability gap where they cannot replace their losses.
And as if a targeted rare earth blockade wasn't debilitating enough, the document highlights how the kinetic strikes in the Middle East accidentally triggered a devastating, completely unforeseen thermodynamic failure in the global semiconductor supply chain. This is arguably one of the most surprising, deeply fascinating mechanical details in the entire analysis.
It is a perfect example of how complex systems fail in unpredictable ways. This specific failure involves helium. During the retaliatory strikes in the Persian Gulf conflict, stray ordnance severely damaged Qatar Energy's massive Ras Laffan industrial complex. That specific facility was responsible for producing and instantly removed up to 38% of the entire global supply of semiconductor-grade liquid helium.
I think most people associate helium with party balloons or blimps. Why do the most advanced microchip factories on Earth rely on helium?
Because it is an absolutely non-substitutable cryogenic cooling agent required for extreme ultraviolet or EUV lithography.
The chip printing machines.
Right. The massive, incredibly complex machines built by ASML that print the most advanced microchips operate at such extreme volatile energy states that they require constant flows of liquid helium to stabilize the optics and prevent the systems from melting down.
But wait, if the facility in Qatar is only partially damaged, can't they just load whatever liquid helium they have left onto a ship and send it to the chip factories in Taiwan and South Korea?
They absolutely can, but you have to remember the Houthi maritime blockade we discussed earlier.
Oh, right, the Red Sea.
Because the Red Sea is an active kill zone, those specialized transport ships must divert all the way around the Cape of Good Hope. And this is where the thermodynamics come into play. Liquid helium is highly volatile. It wants to turn back into a gas. It is transported in highly specialized cryogenic ISO containers.
Okay.
These containers are engineering marvels, but they have strict, immutable thermodynamic holding limits of exactly 35 to 60 days. As the maritime journey gets violently extended by weeks due to the detour around Africa, the internal pressure inside these containers slowly, inevitably builds up.
To prevent the massive pressure from causing the containers to literally explode on the deck of the ship, what happens?
The containers are equipped with automatic safety valves. When the pressure breaches the critical threshold, the valves open and vent the payload into the atmosphere as boil-off gas.
So the irreplaceable, ultra-rare liquid helium required to run the global digital economy is just quietly boiling off and floating into the sky somewhere off the coast of South Africa entirely because the ships are taking too long to navigate a war zone.
Precisely. It is a thermodynamic clock that you cannot negotiate with. This rapidly depletes the emergency safety buffers of the massive East Asian semiconductor fabs and effectively paralyzes advanced chip production globally.
So everything grinds to a halt.
So, when you synthesize all of this, the U.S. defense industrial base is effectively paralyzed. It is stripped of helium for its logic chips, it is lacking the refined lanthanides and rare earths required to build heat-resistant actuators and radars, and it is operating entirely without the economic safety net of the Strategic Petroleum Reserve. It physically lacks the material capacity to forcibly reopen the Persian Gulf.
So we have a hollowed-out administrative state blind to its own data. We have runaway hyperinflation eroding daily life, broken statistical models, physical blockades choking off energy in the Middle East, and a silent, devastating technological blockade from China.
It's a lot.
It is. The central question the document asks next is, how do ordinary American citizens react when they are caught in the middle of this intense, systemic, inescapable squeeze? And the answer is, according to the analysis, they react exactly as the Romans did. They balkanize, they detach from the central state. Let's explore part 6, societal fracturing.
To truly understand the specific demographics of the societal reaction in 2026, the document points to a very specific, tragic class of people in the Roman Empire. The Curialis, or the Decurions.
Okay, who are they?
These were the educated civic elites, the local landowners, the magistrates, the administrators who essentially ran the daily operations of local Roman municipalities.
They were the middle management of the entire Roman Empire. They made the local trains run on time.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But under Emperor Diocletian, to fund the massive military apparatus, a highly extractive, incredibly punitive tax system called the capitatio higatio was instituted.
That's it.
Huh, right. It essentially combined a brutal poll tax on individuals with a heavy land tax. But here is the fatal catch that destroyed the system. The central government held the curiales personally, legally liable for collecting the full tax assessments from their specific districts.
Wait, personally liable?
Yes. If there was a shortfall because of rural depopulation, because of a plague, or simply because of severe economic contraction, the state demanded that the curiales pay the missing difference out of their own private wealth.
That is arguably the worst job description in human history. You personally owe the violent central state money that mathematically does not exist in your town. So faced with absolute financial ruin, what did this educated class actually do?
When the burden became mathematically impossible to bear, they simply fled. They engaged in massive systemic institutional defection. They abandoned their civic posts entirely, they paid massive bribes to use obscure legal loopholes to escape their duties, or they literally retreated to their fortified country estates and refused to participate in the state apparatus.
They just opted out.
This massive flight of the administrative class directly contributed to the widespread collapse of local municipal governance, accelerating the balkanization of the empire into those autarkic, self-reliant survival nodes we mentioned earlier.
The document argues that the demographic stratification of state collapse in the U.S. in 2026 maps perfectly to this historical flight. The modern equivalent of the Roman curias is the educated professional administrative class, the bachelor's degree cohort, the lawyers, the accountants, the mid-level tech workers.
This specific demographic forms the foundational operational layer of the traditional corporate and administrative state. Crucially, they possess the financial literacy to deeply understand the structural math of the decline.
They see the writing on the wall.
They look at the 1.8 trillion fiscal deficit, they look at the debt servicing costs, and they instantly recognize it as a highly regressive inflation tax that will destroy their savings. But unlike the ultra-wealthy billionaire elite, they lack the offshore tax havens and the sheer impunity to completely shield themselves from it.
So they're defecting. They aren't physically fleeing to rural villas in the mountains like the Romans, but they are orchestrating a massive, highly sophisticated institutional and financial defection.
Right, the capital flight.
The text details a staggering volume of capital flight occurring in 2026. A 400 billion net expansion rapidly moving into algorithmic stablecoins. A massive 589% expansion in the tokenized real-world asset market. And spot gold violently breaching $4,500 per ounce.
They are actively, aggressively reallocating their accumulated wealth away from the sovereign fiat currency. It is a structural migration of systemic liquidity into decentralized ledger technologies, acting as a parallel digital ballast to escape localized dollar inflation.
Just getting out of the dollar.
They are completely abandoning the traditional fiat architecture because they can do the math. They know the system is irreversibly trapped by Ferguson's law.
And it is not just financial flight into crypto, it is an active legal rebellion against the decay. The document notes an incredible statistic. In fiscal year 2025, there was a record-breaking 12,297 quit-tam whistleblower lawsuits filed primarily by mid-level professionals.
Right, the qui-tam suits.
For those who don't know, a qui-tam lawsuit is where a private citizen sues a corporation on behalf of the government for fraud, and they get a cut of the settlement. These professionals recovered $6.8 billion in False Claims Act recoveries against corporate and state fraud. They are actively weaponizing the legal system to expose the systemic rot and corruption from within the institutions they work for.
They are trying to hold the crumbling system accountable. Though, as the author darkly points out, the structural ramifications of those Schedule F administrative purges we discussed earlier guarantee that the internal federal mechanisms protecting those specific whistleblowers are rapidly dissolving.
So they're removing the watchdogs.
The state is removing the very immune system these professionals are trying to activate.
Right. So the educated professional class is defecting via digital crypto ledgers and complex lawsuits. But what about the working class? The people who physically drive the trucks, run the power plants, and stock the shelves. The people who cannot afford to buy digital stablecoins or $4,500 ounces of gold to protect themselves from inflation. The text says they are resorting to massive physical friction.
The working class absorbs the total, brutal, unfiltered impact of that $5.37 per gallon diesel fuel and those 28% fertilizer spikes we talked about. They feel the inflation immediately at the grocery store.
Right.
This deep-seated, desperate economic frustration escalated rapidly into mass-coordinated labor militancy in 2026. The source details a massive, highly disruptive regional general strike in Minnesota on January 23, 2026 that involved over 100,000 active participants.
Organized labor started leveraging heavily coordinated strikes across multiple sectors under the banner, "What could we win together?" In early March, roughly 1,000 nursing home workers, represented by CIU Healthcare Minnesota and Iowa, authorized historic, unfair labor practice strikes. And their reasoning wasn't ideological. It was brutally, mathematically practical. They explicitly cited the mathematical impossibility of surviving on a proposed 2% wage increase against compounding double-digit energy and food inflation.
And this militancy is highly contagious. They were quickly joined by public school teachers demanding cost-of-living adjustments, municipal transit workers, park board workers, and highly targeted, devastating logistical boycotts organized by the truckers' movement for justice.
So the whole system is just stopping.
This level of synchronized labor withdrawal threatens to entirely bottleneck the physical supply chain and completely paralyze domestic economic velocity from the ground up.
So the physical economy is violently seizing up from localized labor militancy, and the intellectual capital is fleeing into digital ledgers. How are local city governments responding to the intense pressure from a failing federal state? You mentioned that the Roman municipal governments eventually just collapsed and ignored Rome. What is the modern 2026 equivalent of that?
The modern equivalent is the terrifying rise of municipal nullification. The deep ideological opposition to the unilateral executive coercion we talked about earlier has generated immense, highly volatile legal balkanization between federal enforcement agencies and localized municipalities.
Okay, give us an example.
The document details a very specific violent point of friction to illustrate this. ICE's Operation Metro Surge, which took place in Minnesota in January 2026.
The text notes this federal operation resulted in the tragic, fatal shootings of two U.S. citizens, Renee Good and Alex Preddy, and the severe injury of Julio Cesar Sosakelis by militarized IC agents. It escalated the federal-state friction from a legal dispute into a profoundly dramatic, kinetic conflict in the streets.
And the escalation didn't stop there. On February 26, federal ICE agents executed a highly militarized, aggressive raid on Hardcoat Inc., which is an aluminum finishing facility located in St. Louis Park. They deployed tactical snipers on the roof and arrested 8 local employees.
Snipers for a workplace raid.
The municipal response to this federal overreach was not passive. It was explicitly legally combative.
Led by a powerful Latino advocacy nonprofit called COPAL, and their organizing director, Ryan Perez, the city of St. Louis Park, officially joined forces with the Minnesota Attorney General and the major cities of Minneapolis and St. Paul.
Right.
They formally engaged in active legal nullification efforts against the federal government. They signed a comprehensive amicus brief explicitly requesting federal courts to issue sweeping temporary injunctions against the aggressive ICE activity in their jurisdiction.
They legally argue that the heavy-handed federal tactics were unconstitutionally denying local citizens access to basic public services by ruling through systemic terror. By actively, legally attempting to nullify the president's enforcement mandates within their city limits, these municipalities were formally prioritizing their own localized survival and social cohesion over federal compliance.
Which is exactly what happened in Rome.
The document emphatically states that this behavior maps precisely, point for point, to the fatal balkanization trigger of the Roman crisis. The local nodes are actively legally severing ties with the central state's directives.
And this profound narrative dissonance physically manifested in the streets through something the document calls the No Kings protest movement. It describes this mobilization as the largest, most significant domestic mobilization in modern American history.
Guided by a decentralized advocacy group called 501, and utilizing the sociological 3.5% rule of sustained, nonviolent engagement, this movement arose specifically to protest the authoritarian expansion of executive power and the disastrous fallout of the 2026 Iran war. On Saturday, March 28, 2026, this movement shattered all historical records for public assembly.
An estimated 8 to 9 million individuals actively participated. To put that in perspective, that is roughly 2.3% of the entire United States population mobilized on a single day.
It's massive.
They organized across more than 3,300 documented, synchronized rallies spanning all 50 states. In Washington, D.C. alone, massive, unprecedented crowds flowed continuously across the Arlington Memorial Bridge into Memorial Circle, completely packing the Lincoln Memorial reflecting pool and converging into a massive sea of humanity on the National Mall.
And the author notes a highly crucial structural detail about this specific massive mobilization. It was coordinated almost entirely outside of legacy mass media networks. It relied on decentralized communication.
Like Telegram or Signal.
Yeah, exactly. This massive, unprecedented convergence confirms the absolute, irreversible breakdown of the central state's monopoly on information. The Potemkin ledger, the state is desperately trying to maintain the illusion that the economy is fine and the wars are successful, is universally recognized by the populace as a total systemic failure.
Okay, so the homeland is actively fracturing along municipal lines, massive capital is fleeing the dollar, the physical supply chains are broken, and the military is mathematically constrained by a total lack of raw materials. We are in the final endgame phase of this analysis. Can the United States just negotiate its way out of this?
That's the big question.
Can the State Department step in, use diplomacy to fix the kinetic catalyst in the Middle East, and unfreeze the global economy? Which brings us to the final section, forward trajectories.
The document is absolutely unequivocal on this point. The diplomatic window to resolve this crisis has already violently slammed shut. The fragile, desperate framework constructed to alleviate these massive geopolitical pressures has already shattered upon contact with physical reality.
It points specifically to the Islamabad Memorandum of Understanding, which was signed on June 17, 2026. The U.S. and Iranian presidents remotely signed this non-binding interim agreement.
Right.
The desperate goal was to immediately halt the kinetic war and reopen the Strait of Hormuz to global shipping in exchange for sweeping U.S. economic concessions and unfreezing billions in Iranian assets.
And initially, the global market desperately wanted to believe it. The U.S. Treasury's Office of Foreign Assets Control, or OFAC, immediately issued General License X to temporarily authorize global transactions involving Iranian petroleum.
Which bumped the markets up.
Automated algorithmic traders temporarily priced in a massive stabilization and a normalization of relations, dropping oil prices for a few days.
But the analogy that immediately comes to mind here is sitting down at a table and signing a beautifully written peace treaty on paper, while the physical battlefield outside is still quite literally covered in thousands of active landmines.
That is exactly what happened.
Huh.
The brutal physical reality of the conflict crushed the paper agreement almost instantly. The Pentagon publicly confirmed that physically sweeping the Strait of Hormuz of the highly advanced naval mines deployed by the IRGC would require a minimum of 180 days of continuous, dangerous naval operations.
Wait, 180 days.
The paper agreement demanded a 30-day clearance. It was operationally and mathematically dubious from the moment it was signed.
And politically, it fell apart internally in Iran almost as fast. The powerful, uncompromising assembly of experts fiercely opposed the agreement, viewing it as capitulation, and issued direct threats against the U.S. president.
Right.
Following continued, escalating Israeli kinetic strikes in Lebanon, Iran simply abandoned the pretense and officially closed the strait again on June 20. By July 8, after Iran actively struck multiple commercial vessels attempting to navigate the supposedly open strait, the interim truce formally died in the water. OFAC was forced to revoke General License X on July 7, acknowledging the total failure of diplomacy.
So, as the United States violently enters the latter half of 2026, the global economy is violently transitioning from what was initially viewed as a temporary managed supply disruption into a permanent, entirely unhedged structural deficit. There is no backup plan left.
The catastrophic forward projections at the very end of this document are incredibly grim to read. You have a massive, locked-in 7.1 to 10.1 million barrel per day energy deficit across both the Strait of Hormuz and the Red Sea.
With the SPR basically empty.
The SPR is effectively empty and structurally compromised. The 11,000-mile maritime detour around the continent of Africa is now a permanent feature of global logistics for the foreseeable future. The artificial paper market trying to price oil based on hope is completely collapsing.
The highly sophisticated forward pricing models suggest that global Brent crude will spike violently and sustain levels toward the $120 to $150 per barrel threshold. Consequently, U.S. retail gasoline averages are projected to eclipse all historical record peaks, reaching a devastating baseline of $5.20 per gallon nationwide. The document anticipates that the administration will be forced to implement imminent emergency export caps on domestic fuel, which will inevitably trigger severe cascading demand destruction across the entire economy.
Which will drastically, aggressively exacerbate the social dissonance, the labor strikes, and the municipal fracturing we just spent the last hour talking about. Let's pull back and synthesize all of these massive, terrifying threads. What is the ultimate macro historical takeaway of this entire document?
The overarching synthesis is that the United States in 2026 has perfectly tragically mirrored the exact physiological breakdown of the 3rd century Roman crisis. Facing massive structural debt, the executive branch utilized pure coercion via the dominance execution loop to bypass political gridlock.
Right.
To maintain absolute control, they actively purged the civil service, which inadvertently caused severe institutional blindness. Operating completely blind to reality, they initiated a massive kinetic overextension in the Middle East that completely broke physical global supply chains.
And to hide the massive resulting economic damage from the bond markets, they aggressively manipulated the statistical data with Potemkin ledgers.
Exactly.
And the American populace, absorbing the brutal, undeniable physical reality of hyperinflation and structural constraints, actively defected. The working class defected through mass labor militancy and municipal nullification, and the highly educated professional class defected through massive, decentralized capital flight into digital ledgers.
And crucially, the absolute final nail in the coffin. The U.S. military cannot kinetically reverse the blockades or secure the sea lanes because it is itself physically blockaded by the Chinese rare earth export controls and the devastating helium thermodynamic failure.
Checkmate.
The overarching vital point for anyone listening to this deep dive is that economic and social stability is no longer guaranteed by the Federal Reserve's monetary policy. The math is completely broken. Stability now rests entirely on highly precarious, violently chaotic geopolitics operating completely without an emergency safety net.
Which brings us right back to where we started, trying to diagnose the disease. When you look at an X-ray of a broken arm, it's easy. It's a clear, jagged white line across the bone. But when you are looking at a dying, fracturing empire, it is murky. It's a slow, agonizing decay of institutional trust, of physical supply lines, of cooperative municipalities.
And the ultimate tragedy is that the X-ray machine itself is broken.
Right, because the data we use to measure the health of our civilization is actively being hallucinated by an algorithmic model designed by an administration desperate to hide its own failure.
The central state can no longer physically afford or administratively execute the basic provisions of stability for its citizens. That is the true definition of the third century crisis.
So, we want to leave you with a final, highly provocative thought to mull over on your own as you watch the news this week. If historical empires like Rome inevitably fractured into hyperlocal survival nodes, when the central state could no longer provide economic stability or physical security, what does an American survival node actually look like in the modern, hyper-connected digital age? When your local city council is actively legally nullifying federal law just to protect its citizens from icy raids, and your life savings are sitting on a decentralized crypto ledger specifically designed to be far away from the reach of a debased sovereign fiat currency, are we already living in the fractured ruins of the empire without even realizing it?